Time to start. With or without all of us here. So I'll call the meeting to order, and it's 10:02. We'll just get started. I've actually missed the last couple of meetings. Yesterday was a Board of Supervisors meeting. I did make it to that along with Robert, Jesse, and myself. So we each gave a brief explanation or summary of where we're at and what we're doing. As I was driving home, I think the part that needs to be said that wasn't said is that, you know, we are a volunteer group here of citizens that were appointed and asked to participate, help out. And as I went there yesterday and explained where I was coming from in the beginning and where I'm at now and where everyone else seemed to be, and, you know, we were on opposite ends, and that we've been trying to work through consensus and get to a game plan that we think is best for our community and that we can all live with, which is actually a compromised version of, say, everyone's original intention. And it was pointed out to me that, well, Blake, you should have stuck to your guns, or you should have done this. Well, yeah, maybe. As I was driving home, I realized that, hey, we're the volunteer group. It's the Board of Supervisors' job to stick to their guns. They're elected. They need to do what they've got to do. And so with that, I think, in my opinion, we're doing the right thing here. We're on the right track. And we want to continue to hear from more public, more folks that are out there that might have differing opinions. We believe that we've got most differing opinions represented up here at the table. And so, you know, again, I'd say we're on the right track. So Eric and Robert just walked in, so we're fully represented. Hopefully someone from the tribe will show up also. So with that, does somebody want to kind of do a more of a summary upgrade where we're at, or update? I know that I met with Jesse yesterday for a half hour before the board meeting so that he could kind of download and give me a better understanding of where we're at and what's going on. And I see on today's agenda, we're looking at size, structure, and location, all in regards to outside cultivation or commercial cultivation, I guess I should say. And on Joel's request, we're looking at, you know, instead of indoor, outdoor, we're defining it as a structure or no structure, which seems to make sense. And again, our goal here is to try to come up with some sort of ordinance / policy that we believe our community can live with. And we are also generally in agreement that we're starting slower, not super large scale, and that's what we presented to the Board of Supervisors with the idea that you know, that's where we start here in the next few years. And you know, if things look good or we need to go to a larger scale, then you know, that option can also be played later on. We're not diving into it and embracing it right off the get-go. So that's the message that was delivered to the supervisors yesterday from me. And I also explained to them that we could use some acknowledgement of that policy so that they would understand and basically commit, or not commit, but understand that that's what we're asking of them, and that's generally the game plan. So everybody okay with that? And if somebody wants to give us a quick summary of where exactly we left off at the last meeting and where we need to pick up and move forward, that would be great.
I can do a little of that, and then Joel can fill in. All right. So we're mostly talking about the locations and the type of land use that's appropriate, and we didn't get a lot into setback values and from what we need setbacks, but I'd like to get into that. We talked about defining operations as whether or not they're in a structure or not in a structure, and Joel can talk some more about the reasons for that. And that also has to do with the state definition of indoor and outdoor being more to do with light usage than it has to do with the structure itself, which is can largely be the defining factor in aesthetic considerations. Yeah, so we're talking about the smaller tiers of cultivation, both indoor and outdoor. 500 square feet is the first license type for indoor. 2,500 square feet is the first license type for outdoor. There's some consensus to start there, although there's some interest to start with the next tier, which is 5,000 square feet for indoor and 5,000 square feet for outdoor. So yeah, I'd like to get into the structure versus no structure and how that kind of differentiates where it's appropriate and the setbacks from sensitive zones like residential areas. You know, maybe in agricultural lands there shouldn't be cultivating outside of a structure. How's that? Mic level good? Okay, better. Maybe more. If you limited cultivation to a structure only, then the county has more tools to define and control what that looks like and the impacts that it might have on neighboring areas. So,
just I don't know, maybe to make sure you're caught up, Blake, we're talking specifically and only about indoor cultivation and indoor cultivation license right now. I mean, as far as what we're trying to get this ordinance written at the moment. So we're not exactly discussing outdoor cultivation as far as all that pertains to. It's the indoor, and the state is defining indoor through the use of lights and wattage, and so that's where they talk about what the structure is, what structures are appropriate to be classified as indoor, and using said light usage.
Right. Sure.
So.
And Kurt, can you follow up from what Joel had recommended, structure versus no structure, and how you interpret that? What does that mean to you?
So clearly, in order to have an indoor license, you're using lights. I mean, that's the whole point of purchasing an indoor license and being able to produce product throughout the entire 12 months of the season. And there's many different versions of what one would, I guess, think of as a structure that you would use lights in. It could be anything from a completely enclosed warehouse that you would never even see a window in. It could be essentially something where they had windows, like a house, for example, or it could be as minimalistic as a greenhouse that's completely just plastic all around. And because it's solely about the usage of lights and that permit that you buy from the state or purchase from the state. And so I guess the discussion that we're leaning here is how do we as a community want to define the specific structure, at least initially, that is required for use of that license.
Okay. So
I just want to add to it, Kurt was saying first. I think the discussion can also include if somebody is applying to the state for an outdoor license, and that's sort of I think the purpose of the county focusing on the structure is that the county's not concerned so much with your license type that you're applying to with the county, but the nature of the structure. So if you had a mixed light license, for example, you know, for 2,500 square feet, the county could still further define that as whether or not it needs to be in a structure or not in a structure. So I think that's appropriate to include that part of the conversation too, not just indoor licenses, but outdoor licenses that are also in these similar type of structures.
Maybe, but I'm just coming from the angle of we've been, I don't know if I want to use the word pressured, but we're hard pressed to complete an ordinance of some form of cultivation. And when we start discussing a structure as it pertains to multiple license types, maybe a license type that we're not exactly trying to streamline into getting it made,
we might want to try to focus more on just the license type that we're trying to streamline to getting approved, and then that way it's done, and then we can come back and keep working on the next license types and change our ideas of what structure is appropriate, you know?
And Blake, I didn't really realize until they talked about it a couple meetings ago, is on the indoor and the outdoor permits or the license that you get from the state. Depends on, I mean, a cost is evaluated with if it's indoor or outdoor, and an indoor plantation can get 3 to 4 times in a year where the outdoor only gets the 1. So that's why it's higher expenses.
Sure. So what I'm looking for is just, you know, as the guy that's the chair right now, we need to kind of build a list of things to do, to accomplish today, and I'd like a little more clarity on what those are. And what I'm hearing from Kurt was that, you know, we should focus on the, you know, basically break this down in step 1, step 2, step 3. And so let's define, I guess I would ask it this way: are we all okay with the idea that there's either a structure or no structure, and we will kind of use that terminology and that concept to move forward? So when it's time to discuss indoor and outdoor, we're going to just say it's either structure or no structure? Is that?
No, not necessarily.
We aren't there yet.
I don't think that's anywhere near the realm of even a possibility that you could say that there's a no structure on an outdoor and there is a structure on an indoor. I mean, granted, I can't even contemplate any scenario where there wouldn't be a structure on indoor. I mean, it's pretty much, it's required. There has to be some type of structure to hold all of your lighting and whatnot. Outdoor is classified also as, it could be the same exact scenario as indoor, just with not the light. For example, in a greenhouse, let's say.
That's why we're talking
greenhouse
about.
Is classified as outdoor if there's not as much, if it's below the threshold of light.
Or mixed light. And there's
or mixed
categories
light.
of mixed light.
And so, well, I think what we came at from this, the reason the structure discussion is here is because it originated in talking about, well, we need to mitigate what they would call light pollution. So like people running lights all night long, and it's just like a, you know, like a
Big
city
glow.
out in the field or in somebody's backyard or what have you, right? And so it started off talking about, well, you know, there needs to be no light emitting from your structure, either at all or during certain periods of, you know, the evening through the night into the morning type stuff. Or should we even go a step further and say it has to be a completely enclosed structure that you can't see in or out of, period? And that's where you start to a little bit, and I don't know if it's such a big deal on the 500 square foot tier. I mean, I guess it can be. It definitely becomes a larger dilemma when you get into the next tier up of, you know, several thousand square foot growing situation. If you're saying it's basically in an enclosed building and you can't use lights to a certain degree unless you're in an enclosed building type thing.
Right. So the only reason I was saying that discussion can extend over to mixed light license types is because we're talking about the same structures, the same facility, the same lights, the same impacts and such.
Yeah.
So we can sort of get a twofer in our conversation, even if we are focusing on you know, indoor license types specifically, because the sizing is different too. But there is a convenient middle ground with the mixed light and outdoor licensing of 2,500 square feet that sort of skipped over with the indoor, where the indoor goes from 500 to 5,000. And if we wanted to include something larger than 500 without going to 5,000, then a mixed light 2,500 would be that, and it's very similar to indoor the way we're just defining it as in a structure, because that would definitely be in a structure, the same as maybe a similar type you would have in a purely indoor. You could have an indoor that is a clear plastic greenhouse and still meets the definition to the state of an indoor.
Yeah.
So then I guess our biggest concerns are really about the light pollution.
Light pollution,
When it comes to structures.
setbacks, what kind of structure do you have depending on where you are? We talked about filtration. If you're on a big ag land with far away from residential zone, maybe you don't need a filtration system. in order to get closer to sensitive areas like a residential zone, maybe we need to define specifically filtration systems.
I wonder if,
what are those numbers?
I mean, I wonder if for the sake of, if our concept is to start small and try to build from that, then maybe we should be discussing, I mean, filtration systems is a requirement for anything at this point, and we can build back. I mean, if we start more restrictive, then we can build off of that. I mean, it's kind of been our mantra the whole time. To try to split hairs to say, well, if this property on an ag zone is set back so far from any residence on any other property, we could get ourselves into conversations that may take a lot longer. Maybe we really consider going, okay, if we're going to require filtration systems on anything, maybe we require it on any and all indoor grows. And then at some point in the future, we reconvene and we start discussing, okay, I mean, if we have setbacks that fit, is it appropriate to do that?
Yeah.
Just for the sake of movement.
I'd be okay with that, yeah.
But I think the biggest concerns for the structures, because, the mixed light and the greenhouse and indoor potential there are all very similar. I mean, maybe we should start the discussion with light pollution, because that, if you're doing an indoor greenhouse grow on ag land, what are the concerns for the community with light pollution? Because for me, that would be my biggest concern for the allowance of indoor cultivation in a greenhouse style.
The easiest way to get rid of that would be to say if you're applying for a indoor license type from the state, then you can't emit light, period, at any hour of the day. And that would be the easiest thing. That's like the traditional, what you think of as indoor cultivation.
Right.
Which it doesn't lend itself to future developments and use of sunlight and things like that. But that would definitely simplify it, wouldn't it? Joel?
Yeah.
I think the simplest thing to do is have basically permitting what we call indoor and define it in a way that would allow indoor or mixed use state law permit, and just have like a dark sky ordinance where you can't emit light at night. Whatever your structure is, don't emit light at night. And we could have, so the state indoor definition uses the word permanent structure, whereas the mixed light says greenhouse, hoop house, glass house, conservatory, hothouse, or other similar structure. I like the idea of permanent structure and maybe require a building permit. It's the kind of structure that requires a building permit, even if you're only doing 500 square feet, and you don't need a building permit until you're at 1,200 square feet, just require it. So whatever it is that you have will have a building permit. It'll be a structure. We can put in aesthetic standards. They're kind of vague. And then they'll have to come with a plan to the planning commission, and the public can say, well, what's it made out of? What direction is it facing? From where can you see it? How big is it? And the community can hash out whether this thing is too ugly or too offensive to be in the neighborhood. We can create, they call them like site plan review. You have some principles and standards for the planning commission, but you don't define every single thing. So the community can come and decide. And then you just decide, setbacks, size of the building and setbacks, and kind of everything else can happen with guidance at the public hearing on the permit. Another reason to not really define mixed light or have a mixed light permit is that our tax ordinance has indoor and outdoor. So should our permits be indoor and outdoor. A mixed light, how are we going to tax it? So I think that is actually a pretty, I don't think we're very far away from that ordinance. If we can decide the zoning, the size, the setbacks, I can find language for the other things, if that makes sense to everybody.
Okay, that was helpful, Joel.
Yeah.
So let me offer some direction here, kind of using the order that Joel talked about that. Let's define indoor with a structure, a permitted structure, I guess, is what we're talking about. I like the idea of the no light admitted at nighttime, that, that as a rule. I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, the site plan review process is a wonderful, I guess, catch-all in terms of neighborhoodness of, you know, letting the neighbors weigh in, right? So I think that makes some sense. And then I quit taking notes after that, but in terms of location and setbacks and things like that, so. We good with those first 3 points? Is there, you know, on the indoor category, which is, are we not using the term structure versus no structure, or we're going to use the term indoor?
Well, I think we use the term indoor, but
Okay.
we define indoor as structure. So both, or
Right.
permanent structure.
All right.
Here's a kind of business question. Is there any use for lighting in a greenhouse during the day? If you can't use, you know, emit light from your greenhouse at night, is there a point to having lights?
Yes. You have to have lights during the day for that kind of production, especially if you're going to be buying an expensive indoor license. It's 5 times as much per foot as an outdoor license.
And you're using the wattage of the lighting to help during days like this, particularly if we're considering indoor cultivating, being in the coastal areas, ag lands and whatnot, you would need the supplemental lighting during the day to help the flowers fill out.
Some indoor rooms are brighter than the sun.
Yes.
Okay, so that would give people the option of using lights all night long if they're in a fully enclosed structure.
Yeah, a lot of indoor
Still
growers.
have some ability to use lights during the day in a greenhouse.
There's structures that are convertible too that let light in during the day and then black out at night, so you can run lights during the night.
Yeah, if you're going to invest in an indoor cultivation system that uses a greenhouse, you're going to invest in the light depth system that goes along with those greenhouses. It blacks it out. It's how you can photosynthesize it, get the plants to flip and flower quicker by using dark.
Okay, and then just to go back to what we've talked about before, in the coastal zone, these would be existing structures. But outside the coastal zone, you could build it. And so if you're, you know, you've got a structure that exists and you're going through the site plan review, it might be alterations to your existing building to make it look better or to kind of protect the neighbor from, you know, seeing the plants or kind of whatever is necessary under those circumstances. And that process would have to be defined enough so that if you have a situation like the people on Church Street, if that property did build something, the process would have to be able to build in protections so that that greenhouse is, you know, something they're going to look at. We don't want them constantly filing complaints about the greenhouse. You know,
In the coastal zone, an existing structure, would that site plan review still be triggered?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it would still be triggered, it'd have all the same requirements. So if you've got a structure but it's not permitted, permit it. You know, get it up to code. And then it would still give people the opportunity to talk about the aesthetics of that structure and possible changes to it to make it acceptable.
So, is there anyone up here that want to comment, yay or nay? Well, I'm assuming we're all yays unless there's somebody opposed to what was just presented. Kate's warming up down there and then out there too in a second. Not yet.
No.
The light was on already. As far as, I understand that the coastal zone is a protected area, and so I'm wondering if we could expand into other protected areas, if we could do some kind of definition that way, so that in areas where there's already structures, perhaps, obviously I'm talking about New York Tri-County region, if that could also apply there. And, you know, all of these are just for me conversations, I obviously spoke to clear council, things like that.
Sure.
That would be an idea of one way to manage it so that, you know, you're not adding additional costs. That would be my recommendation.
So you're saying allow it in Klamath, but in existing structures?
I'm not sure even about the allowance at this point. But
Limit it would be the
if-
right term.
If the allowance did occur, it would be limited to structures that already exist.
Yeah, so I've kind of been putting off the conversation about what to do with Klamath, with cultivation, kind of hoping to come to a concept where we've agreed in the details. And then we do need to find a way to protect kind of the tribe's wishes. And I haven't kind of, there's not a land use device right now that I'm like really interested in recommending. And I don't know exactly where the board's feeling is about Klamath, but that is kind of, you know, a major conversation that's looming.
And I would agree with that. And if that's how you're having this conversation, then I really don't have any comments. If you're moving towards Klamath, I do want to make sure that obviously those limitations are considered.
Yeah, so, I mean, and we can get into this a little later, but one of the big problems, one of the reasons we made the combining district is so that we'd have uniformity of zone and keep it away from Klamath. To do that, to duplicate that for this is problematic because the land that's suitable for cultivation is so much more spread out. There's not a convenient boundary like the urban boundary was. So, you know, the things that might have to happen are you know, a rezone or you know, some special built-in veto power for the tribe in certain areas or things like this that I think need a little more research and a little more looking at other communities. But that's kind of, it's an issue. It's something we'll have to deal with.
When it comes to, say, the planning commission phase, an applicant applies for a license to cultivate, say, in Klamath. It goes through the planning commission, which then basically allows for public comment during that period of time. Is that a mechanism that can be used for Klamath to insert in there just that, again, that type of veto power at that moment, so that we don't get into redefining land uses or rezoning properties? If Klamath and the tribe and council were, you know, purely against cultivation in Klamath areas, that would seem to be a very workable moment for them to step in and you know, say no.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we'd have to define the area where they get that veto power, and then kind of define what the veto power is. Is it an actual veto power? Is it a strong deference? You know, this working group can recommend whatever it wants. I'm a little unsure how it's going to play at the supervisor level to take really a lot of privately owned land and give land use control to the tribe over that.
I got a theoretical question for all of you here, including Joel. I have no problem being a tribal member. If the county wants to cede any kind of rights they want to me and my tribe, that's wonderful. You know, more power to the tribe. But what if I brought in here for you all of the tribes, and every tribe said the same thing, but they didn't want anything happening in Del Norte County, period, because the entire county is tribal Aboriginal territory. So would the county and all of us at this table and all the public members of the county be okay with no cannabis cultivation, period, because 4 tribes said no? And so would we just walk away and close what we're doing? That would be my question as a county member and an owner of property. And again, like I premised that conversation, I'm a tribal member, and woohoo, great, awesome as a tribal member. But I just want to make sure we all realize what exactly we're saying when we say that that's okay. Because we're basically saying, well, at any moment we'd be okay with just dropping this whole thing and walking away entirely, just because other tribes said the same. So.
Well, I think that, you know, one of the reasons I do kind of have concerns about recommending a veto power for the York tribe is that if that is going to be given to all the tribes, that is going to cover the whole county. And so a soft veto power, you know, deference, I don't know, we could play with that. But, you know, if we gave Tolowa the same kind of cultural area veto, it's going to cover, you know, all the land we're talking about right now. And if this working group wants to come forward and say, let's not have any of it in deference to the tribes, then let's bring that forward, you know, whatever you guys want. But, you know, the practical hurdles and the politics of it, you know, are something to consider.
I mean, I guess from a public standpoint, myself, not being as familiar with the tribal concerns that they have, I mean, I realize that most of their concerns are based off of environmental sensitive areas. It would be helpful, I guess, from my perspective, to have a little bit more information on the UROC's concerns in general and in detail. What are their general concerns when it comes to cultivation, when it comes to retail, just the industry concerns that they would have that would, you know, that make it so that they're so against it. That, I guess, that just from my own personal concerns and what, you know, what I don't know.
So I guess I'm going to try to get us back on track here. I'm hearing what Kate's saying. I hear what Kurt. Oh, I'm sorry. Ellen. Ellie. Why am I saying Kate? Ellie.
She's the other one here.
Yeah. Got it. Kate was here at the last meeting I was at. That's right. All right, Ellie. Anyhow, I hear what you're saying and what Kurt's point was, and now Eric's weighing in. And, yeah, we obviously can't give ultimate veto power to the tribes because, you know, then we're going to have a bit of an uproar here. As a neighbor to the Klamath tribe down there and a landowner, I'm familiar with this situation, so I've been down there for the last 20 years as a neighbor, and, you know, there's a time when we want to do some gravel, or we want to do some dirt work, or we want to do some restoration work in riparian areas, or whatever it might be, or wetlands. And the tribe always wants to weigh in. And sometimes as a neighbor I feel that they're overstepping their authority. Well, that's authority according to me. It doesn't mean anything. It's just how I feel as a neighbor, right? And so I get this. And so when the tribe comes here and joins the committee and says we want to have a more strict stance in our neighborhood down there, I want to be neighborly and say, sure, then that's what we're trying to accomplish here. And I believe it works, and I don't question their reason why. This is what I'm trying to shut off, Eric. We don't need to know why. Common sense tells me why. All right, so we'll just let that go. But if other tribes step forward, which they aren't, if they were, then maybe it would turn into a situation where we would need to go back and address, okay, why did we allow it in Klamath area?
Well, one of the things that I can just say to that, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, but the way that we have managed working with Humboldt is that we were not just a veto kind of tribe. We've gone into communication with them, we've gone through the process with them, and I think we were the only tribe at the time, and I'm not sure how each tribe in Humboldt.
Need to get her on mic. Sorry, Ellen.
Is it now working? Oh, sorry. I don't know how each tribe is now handling their business in Humboldt County, but I can only speak that we have been willing to work with the county. And so we are not suggesting that we're going to just say, okay, no, all the way across the board. Within the reservation, we want to be able to have that absolute right. And if we could have that in the ancestral lands, yes, we would like to know it. But it isn't, we would like to have it, but it isn't that we're saying we want to stop you from doing reasonable cultivation. What we're really saying is that we know this area, and we're the experts. The tribe is the experts there. We know where those delicate habitats are that need to be protected better than anyone. And so that is really what the stance is. It isn't that if you are within the Aboriginal area or the original area, and ancestral lands, or if you're within the reservation, it's absolute no. Right now, within the reservation, we just have a zero tolerance, and we did that really for safety reasons. We had a lot of issues that were going on within the tribe that required that. And that does flow out into the ancestral lands. But more importantly is protecting the habitat and making sure that it's viable. And I think that's important to Del Norte as well. So I don't think we're really in conflict. It's just that the tribe is trying to be responsible. And I think that is the way to look at the role. It isn't an attempt at a land grab or anything like that. It's really trying to move forward and make sure that as a community we have these areas that are incredibly delicate. We have a river that is sick right now. We have other areas like that and habitats like that that we want to make sure stay healthy. And that's
Okay.
that's really the position.
So,
I was just going to say that I agree with you that it is a deal for the environment that everybody's after, but what, like Kurt was saying, is you got onto the committee as one of the tribes, and the other tribes within the county did not really have that representation, and he is kind of representing the Smith River area. He is a member, and also here as a member, but he has that feeling towards Smith River. If they were represented on this committee, that they may have those same, you know, problems with the Smith River. It's a river that's sensitive to what happens around it. And the other two tribes might be too. So what I think that we need to do as this committee is do it as a county-wide ordinance, and then if it's in your area or other tribes' area, they come to the planning portion of it and represent what they need to represent at that time if it's valuable to have it in their areas, because otherwise we're not going to have it in the county anywhere, because I think that Kurt's right, that the other tribes would come up if they had that chance to and say no to anything.
and I just want to remind everyone, the reason we got off onto this was because it was suggested that in the coastal zone, we use existing structures only, and then Ellie brought up maybe in the tribal or Klamath region, we adopt that same policy.
Yeah, and we looked at the map last week. We may or may not end up looking at it this week, of locations pertaining to the zonings that we've been talking about, and that there was, you know, a pretty good amount of those zonings in the Klamath region as well. And so it was kind of tossed around at that point last meeting as well, like, well, I don't know about those zonings in this area, so.
I sort of hear the at least the Yurok tribe representation sort of asking for the same kind of deference and attention that we would consider for churches that we were talking about in our retail ordinance in the planning commission phase. It's sort of written in that their voice is to be considered.
So,
And
under
that seemed to make people happy and comfortable in that situation.
under CEQA, you know, we're going to have to do a consultation with the tribes for every use permit, but there's not a whole lot of teeth to it. You know, we consult and move on. We could build in more, like a finding by the planning commission that this is, you know, not objected to, or will have no foreseeable impacts on, you know, tribal cultural areas. Even the planning commission can find whatever it wants, but that would give kind of an appealable issue to the tribe. It's some protection. It's not nothing. And, you know, we can play with that. But Taylor, what if we made some special regulations for environmentally sensitive habitat? Would that offer protections kind of indirectly to Klamath?
It could. We're talking about environmental protection outside of the coastal zone.
Yeah, outside of the coastal zone.
It could. You know, there's pretty stringent environmental protections. I mean, ESHA is defined pretty broadly inside the coastal zone, so it would depend on how you want to define that.
ESHA doesn't exist as a term outside the coastal zone?
We have fish and wildlife guidance, obviously, when we're permitting outside of the coastal zone in terms of, you know, setbacks away from sensitive areas, but the term ESHA specifically doesn't exist outside of the coastal zone.
If we kind of took the coastal regulations on ESHA and made them applicable countywide, specifically to cannabis cultivation? Do you see any weird, unforeseeable, unintended consequences that might prevent any cultivation or anything like that?
I mean, that could be a slippery slope. I would say we need to be careful about that and consider that pretty carefully.
Can you tell us what ESHA stands for? Sounds like an acronym.
It's environmentally sensitive habitat area, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, if the tribe's concern is the watershed or, you know, conversion of timberland, we would want to protect those things regardless. It's not like we are otherwise okay with people destroying a watershed, all except the tribe objects. Like, we don't want people, you know, and there's obviously a fairly stringent state regulatory system with what I would want to consider as questionable enforcement commitment. So I think if we just, like we did with the retail manufacturing ordinance, if we just make all of that state regulation kind of incorporated into the county code and we could enforce it, I guess it'd be a conversation about whether that's enough or there needs to be more. And I don't.
Hey, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I guess the concern with laying it on the backs of the county would be the county's capability of enforcing more than what the state does.
Funding is the elephant in the room. We don't have any funding. The working group has no funding. So we're just making a law and we'll see how it goes.
So this is a good segue, maybe do a discussion about the land designations that we're considering first. We sort of talked about keeping timberland out of it first because of these kinds of things that could make it more complicated. We talked about ag zones, ag land use areas, and the manufacturing areas. And then we haven't talked about that yet today. Blake wasn't here when we kind of got into those discussions. That was sort of the meat of it, was making sure the land use designations were consistent with the general plan, manufacturing land, ag land, cross-mixing of uses. And then also, I think we should get into some setback values, perhaps for residential zones. We have the church tree example with an ag zoned, ag land use area adjacent to a more dense residential area. And so that's a good you know, example to talk about footage setbacks from residential land use areas, not just residential zonings, but where the underlying land use is residential.
And this is all specific to indoor still, correct?
I think we can think of it as specific to cultivation within a structure, regardless of whether or not your license type is under 25 watts per square foot or over 25 watts per square foot. That's sort of a minor detail, the wattage value per square foot.
I think that maybe a main component of trying to figure out that setback is the ventilation thing. And so if we are good with requiring you know, ventilation and smell mitigation for a permitted structure on an indoor, then that would influence, I think, your setback. And if you start moving down, as you move down the line into, you know, mixed light, where you may be having a different structure requirement, possibly a different ventilation requirement, that changes your setback requirements.
I'm just saying if we could talk about them as if they were the same for the beginning, that's all I mean. It could be, we don't have to necessarily differentiate. You could have definitions for a structure for somebody who's applying for an indoor license type, and then, at least for simplicity, that same definition can apply for a mixed light. You know, not to complicate things, but just so that we don't have to go back over the same ground when we get to that. That's all. So, I'm thinking like 1,000-foot range for a setback from residential. I'd like to just really get to like a discussion on numbers in certain situations. maybe it's less than that if there is a genuine effective filtration system. I think constant enforcement of things like that might make sense to have at least some setback. If everything's working perfectly, you really don't need any setback, but that's probably not reality all the time.
I think 1,000 feet we might have to look at the maps again. You know, as far as manufactured zones, I would think 1,000 feet might throw a lot of them out.
Sure.
I would think maybe we might want to review the maps to you know, make sure.
I'm thinking agricultural lands, because the character of agricultural lands and it being adjacent to residential lands is quite different than the character of residential lands adjacent to manufacturing lands. The setbacks and rules are already different for similar types of operations in manufacturing lands adjacent to residential lands. I think the considerations would be different. So maybe we could just focus on one or the other at a time, ag lands versus manufacturing lands, because they really are different. They're completely different. They're going to have different sensitivities and such. So
Can somebody help me out understanding what we're talking about when we say filtered or ventilated, or, you know, ventilated could just be an open window or a screen, or filtered is filtered air.
Like odor mitigation, like where you can't smell it, there's no evidence of it.
And how do we regulate that?
I don't know.
Somebody's got to.
The state has no.
We talked about the smell commission. It's a joke, but it could be real.
The state has no filtration.
Not that I've seen. They haven't. I don't know how they measure odor levels, but not that.
Yeah, I
I've
don't think
seen.
there's any, there's no real like set, this is a specific parameter that you must follow. It's really much more broad, and it's probably more something that would be part of your plan that would come forward to the planning commission, and when they approved your license, it would be based upon, here is my filtration plan. You know, here's what I'm doing, A, B, and C, and then that would be approved, and you would go forward. And then there would be the whole smell issue potentially down the line, and there would have to be mitigation taken care of if there was complaints and so forth and so on.
I think it's easy to start with industry standard systems and sizing. And so I think the most popular industry standard system is charcoal carbon canister filter systems, where you're filtering the exhaust air through carbon filter. And these are maintainable and replaceable, and they're not terribly expensive, and they can be sized appropriate to a given plan, a given square footage, a given amount of power consumption. You know, and I don't think it'd be very difficult to create some charts of appropriate systems. There's industries and industry standard sizings based on CFM, cubic feet per minute of air movement.
Seems completely reasonable to have that as like a minimum requirement in the ordinance. Like, at minimum is required that type of filter, you know.
Yeah, I think Kurt's right. You put it in the operation plan, staff looks at it, looks at your plan, looks at the system you're proposing to use, looks at your neighbors, your distances, your zoning, and decides whether it's good enough, basically.
So you're saying not have a minimum number to start with for residential zones?
You mean a minimum setback?
Right.
You know, a setback is good because if your filtration system doesn't work or you don't follow through, it won't require so much staff time. You're already X number of feet away. That's some added built-in protection that's not going to require enforcement. So setbacks are helpful too. They provide some certainty.
Right. So I'd like to get into that discussion.
Okay.
Like, how many feet from a residential zone in an ag area? Like, what are we talking about? Are there different types of ag areas? You know?
Or a residence, probably, like feet from a residence.
Yeah, maybe is it a residential land use area, or is it just a residence? And then is it a permitted residence or an unpermitted residence? I think from the county's perspective, it's easier to have the land use designation maps as the line to go from.
Yeah, typically, we would just be looking at the zoning district in general, not whether there's a residence on it or not.
Okay.
So we do that with our manufacturing
Sure.
district and our commercial districts.
And that protects future residents that can come into an existing residential zoning district, rather than just going off of what's there already. So,
It provides a lot more certainty too.
right. So if it's not if 1,000 feet's too much, is 100 feet too little? Are we somewhere in the middle there, 500 feet? What do we do? Like the Church Tree area, you know, like that, you know, 100 feet's, that's not going to do, you know, unless we're talking about you know, a really enclosed indoor structure with effective filtration.
Well, you know, that would be a situation where you're proposing what kind of structure you're building, and staff is going to look at your neighborhood. And so if we have kind of a finding by the planning commission that plants themselves won't be visible either from a public right-of-way or a residence or from a residential property, then that's going to limit it to fully enclosed or on your property somewhere that's not actually visible for your neighbor. And so those protections will be in there. You know, I think, you know, the Church Street thing, it's not going to be what's there now. That would never get permitted. But, you know, it is an agricultural piece of property that they happen to have built houses next to.
I got a question, and it's a pretty ignorant zoning question because I'm not very smart on what all of these zones are. But I was saying a residence, like a house, right? And then so we're saying residential zoning or neighborhood per se. And so we keep talking about the church tree and this property that's causing some issue with the neighbors. The question is, that piece of property where that is, it's like, I think if I'm correct, it's a 5-acre ag zoned piece of property with a house on it. Is that considered a residential neighborhood, that piece of property?
No.
No, we'd be talking about...
So if we don't talk about specifically residence, like an actual structure, then someone could just drop their structure right next to that person's house because it's not a residentially zoned neighborhood.
Right, so if there was a neighboring agricultural product or zone, their ability to build would have no setback from that house, right? Yeah. So when you're in ag zones and there's houses on them, they're kind of irrelevant for the purpose of this conversation. It's when you have a residential zone where people are not intending to live kind of in the neighborhood of an agricultural use.
Well, and that goes back to what I was saying about a residence, like a house. Like, I don't want to wipe a bunch. There's lots of houses in this community that are built on these 5-acre ag zone piece of type properties. All those people don't matter now, and we're just going to throw a grow house right next to their house, and that's okay. That's why I was thinking of there needs to be a setback from the actual physical residence, as opposed to saying just a setback from certain zoned properties. You know.
Right. It just creates a planning complication is all. That was one of the reasons why we talked about starting with larger parcels. There has been a lot of discussion around, you know, is the classic 5-acre rural, not rural residential, but the 5-acre homestead style, just because it has an A zoning versus an R zoning, does that make it appropriate? Maybe not. You know, maybe we're talking about starting on larger parcels so that the setback numbers aren't such an issue, or defining what is a residence and what isn't a residence doesn't become the county's responsibility every time, but maybe it should be. I don't know, maybe that's within the scope of the project for the county.
Well, we could go back to the closer to your own residence than your neighbors. I don't know if that helps that much.
No, that's not going to apply in this case. I'm thinking we already have ag laws and ag rules and residences that are located on ag property that need to be protected from certain ag chemicals when spraying. And I'm kind of thinking this is very similar, maybe in reverse, but very similar. And part of where Kurt's coming from, I get that. It should be a distance from a residence. However, if that residence is in the middle of an ag zone that's already understood that certain things happen in ag zones. So I don't know that that holds water at the end of the day, but it seems like it might. But so anyhow, I brought up 2 points that actually counter each other, and I'm looking for a little direction there.
Taylor, what kind of rules are there right now about residences on ag land and, you know, what you do on a neighboring property? Is there something about pigs or something? Or is that on rural residential?
You'd have your standard setbacks for residences on ag land, and then you'd have increased setbacks for buildings that contain livestock or, you know, you know, you'd have an increased setback for something like that, but in terms of just residences on ag land, you know, they'd be fairly standard, 20 feet from the side property line.
So if we just mirrored the livestock building setback, would that provide meaningful protection, or is it?
I think it's only 50 feet, you know, and if you're on a 20-acre ag parcel, it's not, you know, substantial. And then you're already looking at, you know, generally a required 30-foot setback per our fire safe regulations. So, you know, if we went with, you know, what a livestock building would be now, it wouldn't be very substantial, but.
So should we have different, if we're going to talk about a number, a minimum setback number, are we talking a different number from a residential zone versus a residence, perhaps? Or treat it all the same? Is that too complicated to have them separate? You know what I'm saying? A residential zone may have a larger setback than just a residence that happens to be on an ag zone.
Yeah, I think it's easy to just have two standards.
Okay.
One, you know,
Let's do that.
it's just what is the feet from a residential zone, right? From the boundary line of a residential zone, how many feet is the setback?
100 feet.
How many?
100 feet. Throwing a number out there.
1,000 feet.
There we go. We got 2 star.
500, right in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, it makes no difference to me. It's just a number to write down. You know, if you're on an agricultural property next to a residence, then you have to play by whatever rules people say. That's just how it goes.
I mean, I guess we would just have to address our concerns when we're talking about setbacks. What are our concerns when we're discussing setbacks? Say, from an ag land to a residential zone is one set of concerns, and an ag zone setback from a residence on an ag zone on a separate piece of property are other concerns. So, I mean, let's start the discussion there. What are our concerns off of those two?
I think there's cultural
ideas.
concerns for residential zones. I think if you ask the residents of these zones, it's maybe, well, first and foremost, it would be odor, because that's the easiest thing to notice. That's what gets people's attention. You smell that. That's the first thing that happens. So we're already talking about the details of mitigating or eliminating that. So we kind of covered that. And then after that would be cultural concerns, that people don't want it in their neighborhood. They don't want an operation that produces a product that's restricted in other areas that has black market value. I mean, that will happen probably forever. Let's not forget, even someday, if the federal government changes its plan and stance, there will probably be states in the union that will have prohibitions for the rest of our lifetimes, you know. So there will always be places in the country where it's prohibited and the product has black market value. So that will probably never end. But the federal prohibition changes things culturally. What's palatable politically to the community and to the board, I think, is a big part of this discussion, at least in the first round. And so a lot of pushback to...
I'd like to jump into and mention lighting again, light pollution. I mean, I think that's going to be a huge concern if we're talking about anything above fully enclosed structures.
Yeah, and I just referred back to my notes when the church tree folks were here, noise and traffic are, you know, the other issues, right? So there's 4 to 5 things that would be a general concern of a residential neighborhood. And I'm not really familiar with Church Tree and how it all looks, so.
Noise and traffic are hard to mitigate, I think, and measure maybe. Those are kind of the, like, whereas with light and odor, you can maybe, well, odor you can't quantify, but you can see it and record it or whatever, and then the filter requirements. But the traffic going on, activity, I don't know, what do you think, Joel? Are there methods to limit?
I can't think of any. I mean, we can control where it is or how big it is, whether it emits light or a smell.
Right.
But we can't really tell them how many cars can come and go.
That's where
it'd be really hard to.
That's where a setback from a residential zone, I think, could be appropriate, you know, at least from the perspective of people in those zones. They're not designed to be commercial.
That's
areas.
the difference between 100 feet and 1,000 feet, right? As you start getting into those type of things that are a little more vague and gray and harder to control, and so that's why larger distances would be good.
I think one thing we should remember, you know, 500 square feet at that scale, you know, you're really is just a home business. You know, it's one person. There's no visitors really coming on a 500 square foot. You know, any more than you'd notice a small family. as far as traffic goes more, you know, with 500 square feet cultivation. So then I think we could, you know, we'd spent some time talking about the 500, but maybe, you know, that could be a real easy one with, you know, no setbacks. We've got filtration requirements. We're really talking 5-acre ag, you know, right? I mean, nobody's, you know, we're pretty much pushed right now to manufacturing and 5-acre ag. So I mean, at that scale, we're really talking about, you know, the only impacts I could think of were the idea that someone could find you online, you know, but that's just, you know, that comes down to whether you have assets or not, you know. I mean, that's something that happens regardless. And maybe you use a well in a dry season a little bit excessively, you know, keeping 500 square feet going year round, you know. I think those could be mitigated through other ways, but, you know, I think we've the zoning we're talking about, the scale we're talking about, you know, I don't think we need a huge setback from residential areas.
So what's a number that you would use, Robert? What's not a huge setback? Obviously, 1,000's huge. So
what we're talking about for, you know, I've thrown this out a few times, but, you know, at 500 square feet, we're only really talking about on some 5-acre pieces, you know, 100 square feet more cultivation happening than we allow for personal. So, you know, I would think that if we're talking like an Ag 5, I would think closer to your own home than to your neighbors, I think would mitigate. It's at a very small scale, you know, so but maybe that's something we should, you know, we should have a 500 scale and a 5,000 scale, and a 5,000 is just a completely different animal. There's just a couple employees happening there. There's there's business happening versus somebody.
I tend to agree a little bit with that line of thinking. I mean, if we are talking, a majority of these 5-acre ag lots are abutted to residential zoning districts. I mean, maybe we are kind of going in that kind of direction, looking at these specific 5-acre ag zones that are conducive to indoor growing, have existing structures on them. You know, maybe we tailor and limit the size of the cultivation space on that and say it's a 500 square foot. If you want to jump up into the next tier, whether it be 2,500 or 5,000, we haven't gotten to that point yet. Then we're talking about the larger ag districts that are only, you know, bordering other ag zones. And so then we would be talking about a distance from residences, not residential zones. I mean, if we start going down that path, I think maybe we could come up with a consensus as to that, because I agree with Robert that the impact of a 500 square foot grow indoors is a lot less than, you know, the 2,500 square foot, which is 5 times as big. So, you know, and again, I agree with him where, you know, the 500 square foot cultivation for indoor being a cottage grow is only 100 square foot more than what we're already allowing for personal grows, but for your recreational grow in 5-acre or more properties. So I kind of agree with that line of thinking.
I had a question for Taylor. Is there a 5-acre ag zone, or I thought most of those were, I thought those were like rural residential.
No, there's a 5-acre ag zone. There's a 5, a 20.
Okay.
And then there's an ag exclusive, which is 40.
Okay.
So.
Got it.
So we could have a number of potential applicants within these 5-acre ag zone properties that may want to go for something that's, you know, on the smaller scale.
Well, I think we just need to all remember too that this is the 500, like you're saying, 500 square foot thing. This is
Small
so
potatoes.
small that it's happening already currently all through this county, and the impacts of this are going to be much different than let's say the next tier that we should be discussing for indoor. And so in this, you know, 500 and less square foot, I mean, our setbacks should really be smaller than we're thinking when you're thinking of maybe a different thing in your head of a bigger grow, or what some people would think, oh, that's a grow. This is not going to be very much. This is half the size of a small house. You know, it's very, very small.
Yeah, Moorhead Road is an example of this Ag 5 type of zone, just for perspective.
Just to keep in mind, though, a 500 square foot canopy license area is going to, your workspace is probably going to be closer to 2,500 square feet in order to really work that effectively. You know, you're going to have other cultivation areas, vegetative cultivation areas, propagation areas, drying and processing areas. If you have even one employee, I think you have to have some other things to accommodate employees. So you might get into that, like, I don't know if the county can say no employees, if that's even within the range of the county. They do that with cottage business and home-based business. They define that where you can't have employees, you know, under the definition of a home enterprise, and home occupations being different. One, you can have an employee or two, and the other one has to be just like family members or something like that. But the county already has something like that. But it's not just 500 square feet. It's not, that's, you know, a 500 square foot grow is a little more than that. You know, to really maximize that, you probably are going to have a little help unless you just really like to, you know, work 100 hours a week all the time, you know. But so you could do it, you know, or you could do it less professionally and do it by yourself, you know. But, you know, realistically, if it's going to be a business, there's going to be a little more impact than the way it goes on now, where it's really underground and people really go out of their way to produce no evidence because they're hiding. And then if you're permitted, you're going to spill out a little bit more. You're not going to be going out of your way to reduce your impact. And so it is some space, so it isn't like, you know, a little tiny garage operation.
So at this point, can we kind of summarize that we're in the 5-acre region? We would only allow up to 500 square feet. Are we all in agreement to that? Nodding yes on that side. Kurt? Ellie?
No.
No?
I'm in agreement for one part of it, you know,
Okay.
but I think we were also talking about manufactured zones. And I think, you know, I don't think we're going to get outside ag and manufactured and maybe some commercial zones with this right now. But I want to see us, you know, looking at it almost as an experiment, because I really feel that it's something that, you know, kind of a property rights issue at such a small scale,
Right.
you know, that, you know, my little home on Keller, I've said I've grown 100 square feet there for forever. And, you know, it's, and now it's part of the code, so we can, you know, it's clearly allowed in the county. And 500 square feet wouldn't be appropriate in my home. You know, that's, you know, even if I built a garage, and lots of people have done it, do it anyways. But for my neighbor's sake, you know, having that going on in my little, you know, 60-foot wide lot, you know, wouldn't be nice, you know.
Yeah, okay.
And, you know, I thought about having a goat too, you know, and they wouldn't like it, you know.
Sure.
You know,
So,
but,
Kurt, what are your issues
you
there?
know, eventually an acre or two, I think, I would like to see us eventually push that maybe it fits a little bit outside Act 5 too. But, you know, I could see for the first round that, you know, that's probably not going to happen.
So you weren't here at the last meeting, Blake, so I'm just going to kind of say a little bit maybe more clearly of what my position was at the last meeting. I get that we're talking about the smallest tier of licensing for indoors, 0 to 500 square foot, which is, in all reality, was made by the state to allow places even in residential zones to participate in these licenses. Granted, it's not what we're talking about. That's fine. If we're going to go forward and approve, and the county makes an indoor, which we're talking about right now, license, cultivation license, and we're going to stop it at a 500 square foot and below, I wouldn't be in agreement with that. Clearly, you don't need me to be in agreement with that. The county can go forward without my opinion. It's just a lonely citizen here, right? But I would be in agreement with that if there was in writing in the ordinance that the county intended, maybe even with a specific date, to amend this with a larger size indoor permitted grow. If not, I wouldn't be in agreement with anything less than going to the next tier that the state offers, which is 501 square foot up to 5,000 square foot as an indoor, as putting that on paper as an actual ordinance that the county was going to allow and permit. So that's where I say no to that, because I'm not okay with just that being on the ordinance and then walking away and not having any other concessions to move forward into the next tier.
Mm-hmm. So Kurt, are you saying that, like that larger scale that you just went through, you would somehow, you can see a way that you would allow that on less than 5 acres, or 5 acres or less?
Well, I think at the moment, the zoning that we came to the conclusion, which was an appropriate zoning, last couple meetings, and maybe we're confirming that here today, was like ag zone, 5 acres and up, and manufacturing zones. We all kind of came to the conclusion that those were appropriate zonings.
Yeah.
And I am of the conclusion, personally, that anything from 0 to a 5,000 square foot grow on those, on that, let's say that smallest tier, 5 acre, is fine, with the appropriate setbacks and whatnot that we may talk about. Now, 500, we're obviously all kind of in agreement, we're good up there.
Right. I could see that with different setbacks for the 5,000. See, to that specifically, we did talk about your concern you're talking about, Kurt, at the board meeting, and I brought to them that concern that I think Bobby also shared, that starting out small is the intention of the working group, but it's not the intention to be stuck in that little box forever. And so they did give some comment to that effect of just recognizing that concern. You know, nobody's asking them to make commitments to the future, but they seem to recognize the intention of the working group to be starting at a point that may not be the end point.
Yeah, no,
I
heard that, and that's good. I just remember when this whole ban and no ban thing happened, and then there was a specific date that was given to have things fixed. Or
although I don't know if the date's particularly enforceable, but it was.
No, not necessarily.
But we could have similar language or some kind of sunset clause intention in there, perhaps.
And I get that we're going to continue working on these other license types, and there'll be different sizings available for people, but just to come back from where I'm coming from, you know, if we stop at and say we stop, and that's just why I'm kind of in a little bit of disagreement here, allowing only 500 square foot indoor grows gets basically nothing that I'm coming to the table looking to gain from this county. It creates essentially no jobs, because it's just taking a person, is basically like their second income. They can't hardly, you can't really probably make that even your only job. You're going to have another job, and then this is kind of like your side business at home, just to survive. It creates very little tax income for this county. It creates, there's a high cost of entry, but in reality, this allows the most entry in this smallest tier. If anybody actually wanted to participate in an indoor license type, this is the way into the market.
I get it. I think it produces a lot more employment opportunity than you give it credit for. I don't think it's going to create, it's not going to create a single large employer, of course, but realistically, a 500 square foot grow is a 20 lighter. That's 21,000 watt lights. You're going to produce, 30 to 50 pounds of product every 6 to 10 weeks. That's a lot. I mean, you're going to gross hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you're not going to do that productively all by yourself. I've never seen it. That just is too much work for one person to do all the time.
I don't think under current prices you'll come anywhere close to that. But yeah, maybe.
Well, I don't know. 40 pounds times 5 is 200 pounds. $500 a pound for indoor is nobody's. That's way lower than it is now. That's $100,000 gross. That's good money for one person. I mean, it might cost you 25 grand to do that. It's still $75,000. I mean, those are super conservative numbers. It's probably really double that. So a 20 lighter is no joke. That's a pretty big grow.
I'm with Kurt as far as, I think that's cool if we can seal it 500 square feet, make it a little bit more permissible, a little bit easier to start, although, probably not enough zoning really to really spur any, too much from happening. But let's seal that up and then talk about, okay, well, what's 5,000? Then what are the setbacks for 5,000? That's a business,
Right.
And maybe just move right onto that right now.
But Kurt, would you, in the interest of forming consensus in the working group as we deliver recommendations to the board, would you be on board with starting with the 500 foot, given what we talked about? If we could achieve some kind of language that satisfied.
Yeah, I'm all for starting like that.
All right.
With the parameter of we're going to continue to expand it.
Right, understood.
But, a lot of things never progress any further from where you're at, And so when something starts and there's one little complaint somewhere, and then someone uses that as the reason why we should never expand it at all, well, that's, you know, if there's not a commitment to keep going, then that's where I don't really come into agreement with throwing out this law and making it so restrictive. You know, if we're going to actually create something, we should make it usable for a greater number of people. And, you know, but I'm all for it in the interest of time and streamlining it, boom, making it this small thing, as long as we keep going.
Yeah. I've never been under the assumption that we are stopping at 500 square feet, because that's not where I would like to stop either. So I'm in full agreement with you, Kurt, when it comes to, but I'm also in agreement with the consensus and the need of our group to start with a point. I believe that, I mean, if we can get to the 500 square foot consensus based off of, you know, where we all agree it should be, what are the setbacks, we should be able to move right into the next phase, which would be the next step up. So I'm all for going with the 500 square foot on a 5-acre ag zone, manufacturing space. Get it on the table, move it forward to Joel, and then let's start talking about the next tier.
Okay.
Why don't we define it like this, the way I stated it earlier?
Yeah.
Just a second. What I'm thinking is, the way I stated earlier, and we all nodded, yes, 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 except for Kurt. And we'll go back to that and now include Kurt as a yes, with the idea that we're then going to move on and do the next level, and we can always come back and readdress this. But for now, we somewhat put it to bed. That's
yeah,
what
I don't have any problem with
All
that, and I think, just this is my 2 cents, that once we do this small indoor ordinance, we should move then to a different, not necessarily a larger indoor ordinance, but we need to work on the outdoor or the mixed light or whatever it is, and then once all tiers of potential cultivation are in place, then we can start reassessing each one of them and how we could expand upon it.
I think that's fair.
Okay,
Okay,
I
great.
just
Thanks for
wanted
waiting.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one thing. I'm a yes under the context that, you know, it's 11:20, and that, you know, now we're talking about 5,000 square feet. So I'm 500 and the meeting's still going.
I walked in a little bit late, but what I think I'm hearing is that are we trying to only push for this original 500 square foot thing to be on Ag 5, nothing below Ag 5?
No. I think, I'll just jump in and answer this, because this is kind of where we came the last couple of meetings, was that the initial zoning that we've determined to initially roll this out on is M zoning and ag zoning, and the smallest ag that would be allowed was ag 5 and up. So those are the zones that this indoor license type would be approved on under this ordinance.
Okay. I mean, just keep this in mind, because Kurt's points are extremely valid, especially about what this 500 square foot license was originally designed by the state for. It was supposed to be a small cottage industry that was, yes, to be able to be fit into residential or small ag zones. It's not something that should have to be approached with such trepidation. It's the very bare minimum. So by us continuing to try to make it to suffice whom, I'm not sure. Maybe you guys know more about who we're trying to pitch this to. But the more we try to like kiss butt to make it like hidden, and like it's going to make it impossible for people like me who want to be active in this community, who want to not have illicit behavior going on, who want to pay taxes, who want to apply for these licenses. It's going to make it more difficult for us to be able to apply for these licenses, simply because of the lack of available infrastructure and space to do this stuff. And, you know, we're already asking for the bare minimum. So trying to find places that we can even squeeze this in isn't too much to ask. So I think it's important to not operate with such trepidation, because it is the bare minimum.
Okay.
Come to the
Thank
Board
you.
of Supervisors meetings.
What kind of
Say that,
zoning
they're
are,
the ones who-
what kind of zoning are you talking?
I mean, I'm not sure what like Ag 2 looks like, you know, like
don't
there's
think
all
there's
those.
such thing as that.
Sure, but there's all these little neighborhoods, and you guys spoke about the Right to Farm Act. There's all these little neighborhoods. Those people know that they live in agricultural zones. And cannabis is an agricultural product, period. There's not any disputing that. And so people are going to live in ag zones. Yeah, there's people doing other things in those ag zones that I might not like. I got to smell cow poop, et cetera, so the further that we continue to create cannabis as illicit, even though it's going to be licensed, and it's licensed throughout the state, and the rest of the state has blossoming businesses, and are bringing in, other counties are bringing in tons of tax revenue, we're sitting in stagnation. So I think it needs to fit into places that that us small players can actually make it a reality.
Sure.
You know?
I think we've got most of your concerns covered. To this point, cannabis is not an ag product. It has not been classified that way. That's my understanding. So it may change in the future, but to date, it is not an agricultural product.
Well, oh, yeah, you're right there today.
Correct.
However, in the current farm bill going forward, the term cannabis and hemp is being inserted as an ag product or at the federal level. So not to point out specifically, but cannabis in general is turning, a specific line of it is turning into an ag product. Now we're talking about a different form that isn't in that bill right now. But I totally get what you're saying, and it's some of the things I was saying here, that this tier that we're talking about is designed to go into zonings well beyond what we're talking about. But I think in the interests of trying to push forward and get a cultivation zoning or a cultivation ordinance in place, I see the concessions that need to be made to restrict them initially, which goes forward to we need to continue to expand this at a later date.
It's going to create limited opportunity. Like to purchase or to acquire an Ag 5 for someone who wants to do a 500 square foot indoor, you're not going to be able to recompensate. It doesn't make sense. It's not a viable business model.
Right.
It absolutely is not at the really moment.
Yeah,
that's where the hopeful idea is that we can expand.
Let me just
upon
weigh in.
cultivation
Let me
and so
just
forth.
weigh in here, because I'm a business guy, and it's not our job to make it a viable situation for everybody, right? It's not a viable. You can't put a dairy farm on 5 acres. You can't fit a pineapple farm in Donart County. There's a lot of things that aren't viable here. That's not our job. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to come to some basic parameters to get this ball rolling and get it started in a legal avenue, and consider both sides. There's a group of folks that don't want it at all. I've been on that side, and so we are here trying to, kind of find consensus and some happy medium. And again, I'm sincere when I said I think we've got you covered, all your concerns. I think we're on track there. So, the only issue was with you referring to it as an ag commodity, and I'm calling you out on that. That's it.
I agree with the direction that you're talking about, and I think it could have been the intention at the state level with that license type for sure. But also, I think it's important and fair to understand that there's an extremely small number of those license types that have been issued, and there's a couple different reasons for that. Most localities and municipalities really hasn't recognized that license type for whatever reason, and hasn't included it in their ordinances. Humboldt's one. They started at 5 acres. They don't have any people like you coming to the board talking about their small garage grows they want to include. So it's not even a thing in most places. And I think
because most places are geared towards the idea of commercial cannabis cultivation without public demonization of cannabis farmers. And that's why people from this community have left to move to Humboldt County, or to move to Southern Oregon, or to move to Santa Barbara County. I mean,
there is trepidation. I get what you're saying, and it's unfortunate that most communities have visited this small tier with trepidation, with the idea of it being included in, more residential type settings. And perhaps this complicates things. So that's why we were talking about timberland originally, because it was out of sight and didn't bother people, and the controversies are environmental rather than cultural and neighborly sometimes. So I definitely, there's a lot of people talking the way you're speaking.
And there's a lot of home businesses in Delnort County.
Yeah, I'm looking at
people have babysitting services and this and that or whatever. I mean, I don't know. You tell me.
Well, there's R1A, which would be sort of what you're talking about. This is a residential and agricultural acre lots. It's what we get immediate pushback from planning when we start talking about this area. And uses permitted with a use permit: small livestock farming, hogs under section such and such, airports, religious warehouses, storage, repair yards, public and private recreational facilities such as country clubs, golf courses, swimming pools. Home enterprises is a definition for that restricts the usage of your space and employment and stuff like that, guest lodging. So you can make an argument that existing county code sort of already permits businesses that could be argued are even more intense use of the land than cannabis. But there's two folds here with cannabis being an interesting business the way it is and interestingly regulated, and the disparity between federal and state law. It isn't like a lot of other businesses. And there's a big list in the home occupation thing of things you can't have, things that seem somewhat innocuous, but they're not allowed because they're deemed maybe to generate traffic or whatever. So there's cultural concerns too that I keep repeating. I don't know if I'm using the word right, or maybe I could find some more synonyms about it, but there's a lot of people who are just scared of it and have trepidation, as the word that you used. And
I mean, there's been two breweries opened up in Del Norte County within a stone's throw of hundreds of homes in the last 2 years. End of statement.
Well, I think you'd have a lot of people who would say that's morally wrong, but they don't have the votes or the power because of the structure of laws and ordinances and code. And where we are right now with cannabis is that we don't have protections and laws and structure. We're kind of creating it. And there's a lot of people who hate it for whatever the reason. It's the devil's lettuce. But that's a political reality, whether it's right or wrong. And so it has to be understood that we, and the board especially, the Board of Supervisors, grapples more directly with political realities than what makes sense. Actual facts may not be political realities. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think that the route we're going with the zoning is that it's the quickest way, I think, to achieve the buy-in of the community to get it into places like you're discussing. We got to get it out there and get it happening to change, in my opinion, the unfortunate view that some people have on the situation that we're discussing. I mean, if once it starts happening a little bit more, these opinions might change and we gain the buy-in of the community and we can further expand it into these areas. But I think we have to, for the whole of the community's opinion, start in these zones and then try to expand from there to minimize the kickback that we're going to get.
And I don't think that I and maybe other people in the community don't think it's the worst place to start. Like, I'm not saying it's a terrible deal. I'm just saying that, yeah, it probably is really important to make sure that there's some sort of impetus or literature put down that you guys make sure that there's a push to allow it to grow and not just stay there.
Sure. I think the perfect example.
Thank you. I just want to point out that the obvious here, elephant in the room, it's still federally illegal. And so we've got a whole slew of folks lined up reminding me of that, and so we are trying to, I think Kurt just said it well. We're trying to accomplish something that allows it to start legally, and so just keep that in mind.
I just throw out there, it took a small army, to get the board, formed. And so nothing's impossible. We do need a small army, I think, to further, for me, I won't be happy, until we do have, where you can have a small project like that on a half acre or acre or 2 acres, and then we're also with the reality that, of what will pass. I think it was the last meeting Heidi, kind of threw out there, we kept saying, how about R2? How about rural residential? How about this? And she threw out anything with an R in it. Just throw it at no. And I see a future where that's not the case. Because I'm going to stay and fight for it. And it might be too late by then for that to be a viable business opportunity. So I would encourage the public to fight for it. We can see what's happening. you can see where the opinion of the public is, so I don't think it's a real rancid opinion that would happen if somebody, you know, got the letter that, hey, somebody wants to open a little 500 square foot cultivation project in my neighborhood. I don't think there would be a very large pushback, but, you know, on the other, we've been working with consensus, and I think things are coming out of it, and I almost feel like if we work fast enough and maybe we can iron the kinks out of what just came out of it because of maybe, you know, if it didn't work out for people in the public.
I will say really quickly, there is the alternative universe. You had mentioned Southern Oregon. I mean, anybody who knows what's going on with Southern Oregon and particularly Josephine County with its large-scale commercialization of its rural residential lots has created a fiasco that the county's currently still dealing with. You've got the county commissioners of Josephine County had sued the state of Oregon to basically wipe out all of their recreational laws, basically almost specifically due to the fact of the over-commercialization and the overdevelopment of the rural residential lots when Oregon first initiated their regulations. And so I think there's some trepidation there, given the fact that California has ceded most of its most of its regulatory framework to local jurisdictions. That's, I think, one of the reasons why you're seeing a lot of trepidation when it comes to municipalities giving, you know, over residential zones to commercialization at this point. There's just a lot of unknowns out there how that's helped. But I will say you've got a lot of, I mean, the small cottage growers have a lot of proponents on this board. It's where we all started out. It's where we've all wanted to focus. But the realities of what we've had to deal with has kind of forced our hands to deal with a consensus. And the consensus is that, you know, pushing it into residential homes at this point in residential lots just didn't, it just doesn't make a lot of sense currently. But definitely have proponents. I mean, I'd love to get there.
Okay, next comment, please.
Thank you, Russell. Member of the community, just want to say thanks for all of your time. You guys have been great in watching the videos and everything. I'm a supporter of the cottage industry thing. I think that's great. I think it's better to have a bunch of small businesses in town. You know, if you think about like fishing, it's better to have 20 captains in town than 1 captain, 20 deckhands. I think it's good for the image of the county to allow small businesses like this. And I think that large indoor in general is a waste of electricity. You know, I personally don't want to see 200 lighters. So, you know, in the age of climate change and everything, like using the sun, and I hope those things become part of the past. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, those are part of the reasons why I would like to not see the county move towards the next stage of indoor cultivation, just because I think growing inside is sort of an abomination when you can use the sun. I think at a certain scale and in certain situations it has its place, but I think that I would like to see the world get away from production of really anything using electricity that intensively.
So we've got 25 minutes left. What's the next subject to tackle here?
Well, let's talk about some setback specifics for residential areas. We threw out some numbers. We're between 0 and 1,000 feet. What about 200 feet? If, you know, is that, if we're talking about 5-acre properties, you know, that's reasonable to achieve a 200-foot setback.
And 200 feet from a residence, or?
I'm talking about residential zones. So if you're 5 acres surrounded by a 20-acre ag parcels, then maybe you're different. You aren't.
I would like to see the setback for a 5. Go ahead.
Just make it closer to your house than anybody else's, or wherever that structure might be. If you know you're right here on a line and you've got 5 acres, you know, as that line goes, it's always going to move with the line. I don't think because one person might not be okay with 1,000 feet. One person might not want it within a mile, and another person might be okay with 50. I think you're gonna. It's probably easier to regulate for the county staff. It's probably easier to write the ordinance to just say, hey, you know, wherever this acreage may be, wherever your residence may be, wherever the lines might be, as long as it's closer to your.
You can't exclude parcels that don't have houses.
That's true, but if you, call it the center of the lot.
And we still probably would need a minimum.
We are already on 5 acres, so I don't agree with that. But
what if you had a weird lot that was only 200 feet wide and 1,000 feet long? That's 5 acres.
I think on 500, we really don't need a setback. I think that the center, you know, closer to your neighbor. And I'll throw it out there again. It's 100 square foot more than we currently allow on that similar property, and with a lot more control. You know, so.
True.
Taylor, what was the?
Could you just call it the center of the lot, closer to the center of the lot than the sides?
I think the issue the issue you arise with the whole center of the lot thing is that a lot of this is geared towards trying to use existing structures.
Okay.
And so you can't manipulate existing structures into being, you know, they're where they're at on the lot. And so I think that would be difficult in those scenarios. Yeah. I mean, new construction.
New construction.
Yeah.
I'm thinking political viability. People don't know, like when Eric talks about what happened in Southern Oregon and other counties around California, people heard that they're growing weed in the neighborhoods. They don't give a crap what the size is. They're not going to go looking up the difference between 500, 5,000, 50,000. They just hear you're growing weed in my neighborhood and I don't want it here, damn it. That's all they're thinking about. And so it's politically, when you start talking about
that's a fact.
Commercial grows in licensed commercial grows that are on record in a neighborhood, that's the issue. So I'm thinking politically, a setback number from residential zones sounds nice, and it makes people feel good.
It's a feel good number.
We live in the state of California. Politics rule.
Yeah, we live on planet Earth. Politics rule. I don't know.
Hey, before we move on, just a quick question. Joel, was there actually a definitive finding on whether or not schools required a standoff or places of worship? Because if we're talking about residential, can't you have permitted use for religious buildings? So I don't know if we actually completed on the commercial aspect of it, but if we're mirroring a standoff for simplicity's sake, having it somewhere around the lines of manufacturing to the commercial sales.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that for cultivation. I wasn't really thinking that it was going to be an issue, but yeah, we can put in the same finding, the sensitive use finding, you know, no likely foreseeable impact, or we can do 1,000 feet from a school, I guess. Trying to think of the schools that would kind of be in play, but
I would just add that this cultivation is going to would have a much less impact than retail. So to mirror the same setbacks from the schools and whatnot would probably be an absolute maximum in my mind. And if anything, you would want to have it possibly less, not necessarily less, but you would only consider going smaller, in my opinion, just because this is not...
the board won't go below state standards, and I believe it's 600 feet.
No, yeah, you would definitely probably stay with the state standards on all that. And I think the 600-foot thing, that applies to all licensing, so I'm fairly certain, not just the retail licensing. So.
And the question was brought up, it wasn't for moral or ethical, it wasn't part of the debate, it's simply for simplicity. To see if that makes it easier on us.
So what we amended it to was 1,000. We kept medical and recreation the same for schools. It would be really easy to just say within 1,000 feet of a school or a residential zone. You know, I mean, that would just create a buffer more than a setback so much. It would create a buffer zone around residential. 1,000 is probably going to exclude most, if not all, 5-acre lots next to residential.
Well, you don't have a 1,000-foot buffer for residential zones for retail, right? Am I wrong?
No, not for retail.
The zoning does that.
Let's get to our next comment here, please.
All right, so my question is this. The other day I had something brought to my attention. It goes along with the whole being around schools, being around daycare centers, places of child care. I live basically what I thought right in the middle of town. Come to find out, I'm not in the city limits. How is this going to affect me when I have a school, 2 schools on one side of me, and a child care facility? I have 2 just up the road on the other side, plus a college. How does that affect me? I'm not in the county.
In the county or not in the county?
I'm in the county,
In the
I'm not in
county.
the city.
Yeah,
See,
in the
This
county.
is the thing, you know, it's a residential area, by what you guys are saying. It's right in the middle of a community of homes. Because of things like this. This is where the problems lie. The city lines and the county lines are shaky at best. There's an assumption with a lot of people in this community that the county lines are drawn for a specific reason and everything within those lines and boundaries is city. It's not. So, or county. So how is that going to come into effect? I've been a medicinal card holder for 5 years. I ain't out there to make money off of nothing. I give away pounds of marijuana every year to people who need it for medicinal purpose. That's who I am. That's what I do. That's my belief in life. As a Native American man, I should help take care of people and provide what I can, no matter what it is. I deal with cancer patients, people with terminal diseases, veterans. These are the people that I take care of in our community. This is what I'd like to be able to do. I'd like to be able to do this from home. As it is now, I gotta run, 20 miles out in the woods to another piece of property so that I can care for people. Certain things need to come into consideration like this, It's a hard thing to deal with, I know. But the thing is, unless there's definite lines drawn, you guys can go around and talk about it all you want. But see, one side of the road is one way and the other is the other way. You literally cross my street and you're now in city or county or whatever it is, the city limits. So in order for you to say that these standards need to be set for city limits, people think they're in the city limits and they're not. They're actually county. People think they're in their county, they're not. They're actually city. So with that note, you guys really need to take that into consideration because just because it works for city doesn't mean it's going to work for county. And then you're going to end up running into the same problem that it's right across the street.
Let me kind of address a few of those things, and then you might have more comments. But we are only dealing with everything outside the city limits. So we're in the county. That's what that's the mission of what we're trying to write the ordinance to regulate and monitor everything outside the city limits. The city limits are being handled with another group. And then
I am with the outside of the city limits, sir.
Right. So yeah. So we're in the county. That's us. And then we are trying to balance for all folks that some that want, some are a yes, and some are a no. There is a residential rule that you can grow some. That's what we were mentioning here within your current situation, as long as it's under some other parameters. We dealt with that in the last few months, and today we're only talking commercially, right? So what we hear you saying is that you would like us to allow for you in your situation, and we're hearing that. I don't know that we can accommodate, but I think we've heard it.
Well, no, my point is this. You guys go and you set guidelines for this, when right across the street, they don't apply.
We don't have jurisdiction over the city, though, in this panel.
That's what I'm saying. You guys are trying to pull all this.
I get what you're saying, though, when it comes to zoning and land use and things like that.
Exactly. I'm a homeowner.
You can have one property that the county says is perfectly suitable for cultivation and licensing, and then you can have a property across the street that seemingly is the same, but it's crossed a line that is now in a different zoning. And sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And we've talked about this phenomenon with planning and zoning, that unfortunately a line needs to be drawn at some place. And oftentimes it doesn't make sense. It's a best attempt, it's a rough attempt to create zoning districts and achieve a sensible plan for the community. But oftentimes the line does land in places where it's interesting and it creates conversations about what is the difference on one side of the line or the other. But short of figuring out a way around that, I think that's just one of the natural limitations of planning, is that you end up with lines that don't always make sense, what goes on one side or the other.
And we're trying to, we have no control over those lines or the zoning within those lines. So all we're trying to do is simply write an ordinance, which is some rules that would apply in the county zones, and we have decided that the ag zones and the manufacturing zones are the ones that would kind of be more priority in terms of cannabis trade and some growing. Now we're talking about commercial, under the idea of commercial growing, and we've started with this small 5-acre, 500 square foot, and we're about to go larger. So that's in a nutshell. Thanks for your comments.
So I'd like to see some kind of actual, go ahead, sorry.
No, not at all. Essentially, I think I had mentioned previously at another meeting that the 1,000-foot setbacks from cultural sites was going to be a problem within, just to make sure, since this would be down in the Klamath area, so long as there are actual cultural areas there. So if we did it on the outside of a particular zone, like if we created like a cultural zone, then perhaps it would work, but it wouldn't work just for a specific site. I just wanted to make sure that that was part of this dialogue, because it is somewhat like a church or something else. So. But that's going to be another conversation. It sounds like there's a lot more information that needs to be provided for that. I just didn't want to leave it silent.
Certainly, yeah. If there's ever maps created for those potential zones, that sounds feasible as compared to individual sites.
So setbacks, right? That's kind of, didn't we just leave off at setbacks?
I'd like to see a number for residential zones.
And so setbacks, Blake threw out a number of 1,000, and somebody countered it with 100, and they countered it with 500, and all these things. But I think part of what you need to think about when you're thinking about setbacks, we need to look at, well, what size lots are we okay with this on? And we've come to the conclusion that an agriculturally zoned 5-acre lot is an appropriate lot where you could be putting this 500 square foot on. And so then, think about that lot in like a square. I mean, forget about the fact that most of them aren't square, but just in a square scenario, how many feet is all that? That's what, like 500?
600 something by 600.
600 by 600. So you throw out 1,000, let's say 1,000 foot setback, all of a sudden there's multiple, like mentioned here, multiple just identical lots that are completely unusable solely because there's a border of a house, 2,000 or 3,000 square feet that way, and its property is such, and then its zoning is such, and then all of a sudden there's a 5-acre ag lot next to it, and that house could be, it could be at the other end of its property that it's on.
Yeah, but if it's a residential zone, then they might develop that and build a bunch of little houses right there, and that's the whole point of residential zoning and planning and such.
Yeah, but so on a 5-acre lot, to have a 500 square foot grow, it's not appropriate anywhere on that lot because it bordered.
Well, that's why I'm not advocating for 1,000 feet.
No, that's why I'm pointing out that.
That's why I'm saying 200 is good, because a 5-acre lot, if you were talking square lots, 600 feet or so.
I was just trying to point out that the
it.
idea of a 100-foot setback is probably more appropriate on the appropriate end of that discussion than 1,000, in my opinion.
I hear you.
As far as
if you got an ag lot and you're adjacent to other ag zones, then you don't need a setback, so that's great, so those are just more desirable properties, I suppose. And
your setback would still apply. It's just the fact that it's the residential zones
are
so far
exactly.
away.
It wouldn't have,
Hey, Taylor, how far was the setback for the livestock buildings on an Ag 5?
I want to say 20 feet.
20 feet?
Yeah, it could be 50 feet in ag exclusive areas. I'd want to check on that for sure, but it's in that range.
I mean, I think 100 foot is a sizable amount. I mean, if you think of a straight shot, 100-foot run, it's a pretty decent distance. And when we're considering the nuisance aspect, because that's why we're talking about setbacks. We're trying to consider all of the nuisance aspects that occur because of that. 500 square foot grow, the nuisance aspect is very minimal. When you consider the fact if we go to 2,500 square foot, it's 5 times as large. You're going to have 5 times the smell. I mean, an appropriate space in my mind setback would be 100 feet from a property line. I mean, and that's just, I'm throwing that number out there because, in my experiences, the smell from that size of a grow isn't going to be as pervasive the farther away you go. The larger you get, the curing space is required for a 2,500 square foot space. That's where you're going to get most of your noxious odors and whatnot is going to come from the curing time.
You can generate some noise from exhaust air too. So 100 feet away from like an exhaust vent,
you're not going to really hear it.
That's appropriate.
Yeah, I mean the decibel level from something like that over 100 foot is minimal.
And just activity, just work activity. You know, like I'm hollering to my work partner across the property to get over here with the wheelbarrow. You know, I mean, like you can generate, you know, so-called nuisances just by working. You know,
but 100. I mean, so if we're throwing out numbers, you know, in my mind, I think 100 foot would be a decent.
That should include your whole operation area. Like as you submit your plan to the planning commission, you have a defined workspace operation area. You know, and you could probably apply that setback to, you know, your entire operation area or areas if they're non-contiguous. You know, and
like the start of your design architectural plan.
Right.
That you submit to the county has to be 100 foot back and nothing within that workable space.
Seems like a good starting point.
Spot.
So to summarize, 100 foot setback from the nearest lot line of a residentially zoned property, and otherwise follow the livestock building setback?
Or just whatever the building setback is for the building.
I don't think the livestock building setback applies.
So
maybe I don't understand what that is.
In a situation where you're on an agricultural zoned property and there's not a residential property nearby, what's going to be the setback?
I would say, well, if you're talking about existing buildings, I would suggest nothing if you're dealing with existing buildings. Because if you're in an ag setting and you have an existing building, you should be able to use it.
So we're talking about only existing buildings in the coastal zone? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Yep. In the coastal zone. Yeah. Outside the coastal zone.
Yeah, so I think they made a point there, existing buildings that are outside of the setback from the residential zones, but we still need to consider property line things. Existing buildings, maybe there's no setback, but if you were going to get a new building, right, if you were getting a building permit, then it's property line setbacks probably are, and I don't know what the absolute minimum is on a building permit, but it might need to be slightly more than that. You know, they don't want to build a building like within inches of your property line.
It's different on a side yard and a rear yard and a front yard. There's different numbers and different zonings for setbacks.
But we're talking about
building,
an ag zone particularly.
Right. So maybe a new building, like an existing building, should meet the same standards that a new building would have to meet for setbacks if you wanted to get more restrictive, so you don't end up with grows that end up closer to property lines than they would be if you were building a new building. But I don't know. When you're not adjacent to a residential area, I just don't see the need for the setback, honestly, other than to make people feel good again. But it's, you know, from a practical standpoint, you know, your neighbor could easily be producing far more nuisance than you are, you know, at any setback.
I was just thinking about in this particular zoning, and it goes for manufacturing as well, but in ag zoning, a lot of buildings are oftentimes built on the edges of properties. And so if you adhered to a large setback for existing structures, you'd be wiping out a lot of existing structures that had possibilities, and part of the idea is to use existing structures. That's why I was thinking that you would want to be more lenient on existing structures that are already there in reference to their existing property line, as long as they're meeting residential setbacks that we were discussing. There's two different setbacks, right?
Okay, I think we're all looking for direction.
So we're talking 100 feet from a residential property line, unless it's in an existing structure.
No.
No.
I think
Joel, would you be okay with us splitting it, or?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I do think though, you know, if you said in an existing structure doesn't have a setback from the property line of a non-residential property line, that's fine. But I don't want to go to the Board of Supervisors and say, if it's an existing building, no extra setback from a residential property. I just that's going to be objected to.
No, I think you definitely still want to adhere to the setbacks from the residential property, whether it be existing or new. I think that's completely appropriate. That's what we're trying to get at. That's what we're trying to protect.
I would think that the 100-foot would work under both scenarios. It may not occasionally, well, that, you know, I realize that also.
So the existing one here for special yards and distances between buildings, accessory buildings, barn stables, from not less than 20 feet from any side or rear property line, not less than 50 feet from front line, not less than 20 feet from any dwelling on the property. Yards for the use of livestock shall be fenced, keep animals not less than, oh, that's just fences, 20 feet from the dwelling.
Well, I would think that existing structures that are on existing properties, if you adhered to 100 foot from the border of your property, that you would make a huge difference, because there'd be a lot of existing structures that are within 100 foot of their property lines. And so that's where...
Well, it's 100 feet from a residential, it depends on what your neighbor's
Oh, that's
doing.
completely, we're all on board, I think, with that. 100 foot from a residential neighborhood, whether, or residentially zoned property, whether it be...
Well, Joel said it as it's the resident's property, it's 100 feet from their property. Doesn't mean it's 100 feet from the perimeter on 100% of your property.
I think we're saying the same things.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that, and what I heard Joel say was, he thinks it's fine if existing structures on existing ag land, as long as they were more than 100 foot from a residentially zoned piece of property, are fine with no setback from their own property line.
Right.
But,
is that true?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
So that would be in the coastal zone where we're dealing with existing buildings, no extra setback from another agricultural property line. But outside the coastal zone, when we're allowing new things, do we want a setback for when you're building?
I think they needs to be the same as the setbacks for building buildings for whatever the purpose, because if...
Well, it will definitely be at least that.
Right, but I don't think it should be in addition to that, because you should be able to develop your property as you would following county code. Right here, it's 5 feet for an accessory building from the rear yard on agricultural exclusive districts. So, you know, for future use, cannabis may be a fleeting thing. You know, it may make sense, much more sense from a development standpoint, to build your building within the setbacks already defined by the county, and not have it built specially for cannabis and then have the use not be for that later on. I think just from a development standpoint, we should be building new buildings, you know, and then I just don't see the need to have a special setback.
I agree with you on that, Jesse, completely agree with you, and I think that you should do that on new construction. We should just follow the existing building codes. If we chose to have a little bit more stringent for these type of permits and associations with these types of permits, I think that's maybe okay, but I don't think it's necessary by any means, and it's probably just as easier to go forward with the existing building code.
I think we're probably all in agreement of that. You know, I'm not here to argue that either way. I mean, I think if you're going to be on the premise, it really doesn't matter so much where you're at on there. And so we could argue forever over the difference between 20 feet and 50 feet and 100 feet, but I don't think it accomplishes anything.
The only thing that I got back to was when I mentioned earlier about that Ag 5 zone property on Church Tree. You know, the guy's got, he's got his house on the corner of that lot. Well, it allows someone to place a building, build it right next to him. Now, granted, they could have already done that anyway with any other industry that they chose, but it allows someone to build a grow house.
Yeah, but
within.
Not in that situation if we're talking about 100 feet from a residential zone.
Well, that's not a residential zone, though. That's what I'm saying.
The adjacent area is residential. The lot's not, but then the adjacent area, so that's exactly what we're talking about. It's an ag zone property adjacent to residential.
Yeah, but so that piece of property, forget that there's piece of properties like that that are out there that aren't next to residential.
Wouldn't be able to get a legal permit.
Right, and those are
what we're doing.
Those are good.
Huh?
Would not be able to get a legal permit according to what we're doing?
Yes, they would.
Well, it'd have to be 100 feet from the property line, and I don't know if that one is.
100 feet from what property line?
A residential
The neighbor's
property.
residential.
I understand all that, but what I'm saying is that that ag, 5 acre zone piece of property is not residentially zoned. Therefore, the 100-foot setback from residential zones doesn't apply to your house on a 5 acre ag piece of property. And if your house is on the property line of that.
So your neighbor, in your scenario, both properties are 5 acre
Yeah.
residentials?
Yeah, because that's what happens. All of them line up next to each other generally. Like, for example, Moorhead Road.
Yeah.
They're all 5 acre ag zoned all the way down. Oh, not all of them, but
Yeah.
lots of them. And some people have their house on the corner.
Yeah, next to the neighbor's.
And
house.
someone could pull the building permit and build the grow house, what is it, 20 feet from the property line, and then the house and the grow house are 40 feet apart.
So the question of the day, is it worth us, do we address that today, or do we?
I'm not actually following that.
I'm not either, I'm missing something.
Yeah.
there.
If you have 2 5-acre,
Ag properties that are next to each other.
Where's the residence
And the
coming
houses
from?
happen to be down in the corner, the buildings next to each other. That's what he's addressing.
That's all I'm saying.
you're saying they should have extra protection?
No, I'm saying that the 100-foot setback from residential zones do not apply to that
In that
residence.
situation.
Yeah.
Correct.
That's what I'm
Right,
saying.
well, that's back to our earlier
And that
discussion.
rolled back to the new buildings, should they be,
And that's why we had this last 30-minute discussion about, do we have an additional setback? And I think the conclusion was, no, we don't. We just go with normal building.
Right.
yeah.
That goes into a discussion
And
about,
so now you're just pointing out that, okay, that situation's going to happen.
but that's a
And
different
I think we're already there.
Yeah, okay.
Well, that's to what we were talking about earlier, is that are we going to talk about only residential zone property lines, or are we going to talk about residences separately, which we still could. We could have different, and we talked about having different values for that,
Hard
like
to define that.
a value. Yeah, but Joel's pretty good with definitions. So
I don't want to do that.
Right.
I
Thank you
mean,
for being clear.
you know, if you've got, in that same situation, the ability to build any other agricultural building, you know, you're on ag land, you built your house next to the property line, you made some decisions, you know.
Right. So I guess it comes down to, if you're on ag zone, too bad. It's only 500 square feet. They're going to have a good filter. You're not going to smell it.
Yeah,
They're
and-
complaining.
And that's the purpose of that additional
Correct.
20-foot
You're in an ag zone.
setback. Yeah.
All right, very
Okay.
good.
So I think,
So that the M zone, that doesn't apply.
correct.
Yeah, different discussion for M zone. Let's talk about that for our next meeting as we make our agenda here.
So we're a few minutes past, we're going to wrap up, and next agenda.
So
for
can we meet next
meeting.
week again? Is that cool with everybody?
I'm out of
Wednesday?
town the next 2 Wednesdays.
Okay, well, let's,
Well, I have enough to start drafting, so if you want to set this 3 Wednesdays, I think we could have a draft.
Okay.
Okay.
It won't include, well, it might include
I don't want to wait to
manufacturing.
meet 3 weeks, though. We got other things to talk about.
You don't want a vacation?
No. I want to get this done and then go on vacation.
You know, I'm available twice a week.
Me too, every day. All right, so,
Other than
Anybody else
Wednesday,
willing to meet Wednesday?
is there an other than Wednesday option for next week?
we can talk about manufacturing zone specifics.
We've always found that this room is like so booked
Yeah.
for almost every
Wednesdays seem
day.
good, though. Do we have a way
Wednesdays
to-
seem,
can we
they
call
cleared it out. I don't know if they're
Kylie?
scared of us or what.
Can we call Kylie now and see if it's available next Wednesday? You have that power? Who has that power? Yeah.
10 o'clock.
And then, so for our agenda, should we talk about this scale in M zones? We
Sure.
could probably talk about that for a while. I think so,
I think-
quicker.
I think that's gonna be a lot. Yeah, that might be the last thing just to quickly discuss, is just how these maybe setbacks or other requirements pertain to the M zone.
Okay.
And in the meantime, Joel sounds like he's gonna be.
Do we want to broach other license categories as you talk about, like a mixed, we'll call it outdoor since our tax thing. Before we end, a quick question. Do you think our tax ordinance definition, indoor, outdoor, could we apply the outdoor to mixed light being an outdoor license type? Or would that need?
I'd have to go back and look at what,
It's an outdoor license type, isn't it?
no,
I mean,
it's,
I guess.
You get what
It's
I'm
a
asking though,
mixed-
right?
yeah.
Somebody can't slip out of it by saying, oh, I'm not indoor or outdoor, and then it doesn't apply to the county's ordinance, but.
Right, right. It should be one of the two. Considering the intensity, I would think we'd want to tax it as an indoor. But
No.
you're saying you don't want to?
I mean, the intensity of the mixed light is way less intense.
Because a mixed light license may not even be using artificial light at all, because just pulling a plastic tarp over your plants for 3 hours is now mixed light, so. Anyway, getting off track, we could just talk about outdoor cultivate, 2,500 square foot outdoor.
I think we need to go on to the next.
Okay,
more-
we'll just call it outdoor.
Which is probably outdoor.
We'll just call it outdoor, whether we talk about mixed light or not. Okay.
Then let's talk about Timberland.
Okay.
Justin.
What? Oh.
I didn't get that,
You know,
Oh.
is outdoor going to be viable anywhere, you know, on ag land anyway? Is it really going to be out on TPZ and PO where outdoor is viable?
So I'll just put 25.
Let's save all these
foot
fancy
outdoor.
answers for next time, right?
Yeah, I'll just put, so I'm going to go up and deliver the agenda right after this meeting, so I want to get it clear. So we'll talk cultivation, indoor cultivation, M zone on the 500 square foot, and then 2,500 square foot outdoor, and then as a.
Which is the smallest tier of outdoor.
Yeah.
Can we make it M zone or other applicable zones? I was always hoping we'd stretch that into C4, which is very similar.
I think we got a definitive no on the C4 because of a land use conflict. A general plan
I don't
conflict.
think any of that is off the table in the future, I think, but for our.
Yeah.
for
For now it
the
is.
ordinance, we already came to the conclusion at the other meeting that these are the two zones we kind of have to go forward.
Yeah, I remember Heidi specifically asking that not to be part of it because it.
But I think definitely, I'm.
In the
with you
future.
there, that in the future, in the next incarnation of trying to amend this ordinance and make it larger with the, yeah, we have what the supervisors
Are going to do that, those type of zones should be considered, and to the public's comments here, residential zones
True.
of some R zoning need to be a future consideration, whether it happens or not, is just.
The
future consideration.
subcategories for the 2,500 foot outdoor will just be zoning, just appropriate zoning. We can, instead of specifying them, we'll just discuss appropriate zoning. Does that work, Joel? For the 2,500 square foot outdoor item on the agenda, I'm going to put underneath it, discuss appropriate zoning. So we're not picking individuals if that works.
All right. And in terms of the meeting, it will be next week, 10 to 2, or 10 to 12 again, and the week after, can we take that one off and then reschedule for 2 weeks from
We're doing
now?
every week for like the last month.
Yeah, we haven't
All right.
confirmed the availability of the chambers here today, but we'll shoot for that,
right.
and then it'll be on Facebook.
Okay. Every week.
All right.
But
Thank
what-
you.
Check
But
the-
what Blake, I think, was trying to say is he's not going to be here
Yeah.
for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Correct.
So the following week, can we make that 2 weeks instead of just 1 week?
Potentially, or meet
Yeah.
every week so we don't miss Blake.
Well,
Make sure we don't miss Blake is what you're
Well,
saying.
Blake's going to miss 2 weeks.
Right, but then the
consecutive.
third one, we'll make sure
Right.
we meet on that
Right.
date.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't want to leave you out.
Yeah.
We want you to make the
Yeah.
decision.
It's easier when you're chair. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.